Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the Ozark Mountains. Before we start, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is when you're listening to this narration. We want to know where these documented accounts go and when they get there. It was the year 1884. As the rest of America moved into an age of industrial progress, the Ozark Mountains' remote valleys and hollows stayed mostly the same. Communities lived in almost complete isolation from the outside world in these old highlands that stretched across southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. There was a nameless settlement about 42 miles from Springfield, near what is now the town of Branson, that was hidden among the mist-covered ridges of southwestern Missouri. It didn't show up on any official maps of the time. It was here, in a place that only locals called the Basin, that one of the most disturbing parts of American history happened. This part of history would stay hidden in county archives for almost 80 years. The first written record of the Blackwood family is from a census in 1851. It says that Josiah Blackwood, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children moved to the area from an unknown place in Tennessee. The census worker only wrote down that the family said they wanted to be alone for religious reasons, which was a common reason at the time to avoid being asked more questions. Local church records from the Methodist Episcopal congregation in Hollister mention the Blackwoods' arrival only once, calling them peculiar in manner but firm in faith. This description, which seems normal at first, would later take on a more ominous meaning when seen in light of what happened next. They moved to a remote valley that could only be reached by a narrow trail that wound through thick oak and hickory forests and across dangerous ravines that had been cut by flowing water for hundreds of years. Land records at the Greene County Courthouse show that Josiah bought 156 acres of land from a homesteader named Ezekiel Porter for a surprisingly low price. The bill of sale says that Porter was eager to depart these premises forthwith. What the records don't say is why Porter left so quickly, leaving behind improvements that had already been made to the property, such as a 2-room cabin and a barn that was only partially built. The land transfer document has a note in the margin that says, Porter claimed Hollow was wrong somehow. This note is written in a different hand than the main text. Payment accepted despite incompletion of terms. This strange note, found by researcher Dr. James Harrington in 1952, would later be seen as the first documented sign that something about the place itself made people uneasy long before the Blackwoods moved there. Where Porter went after that was a mystery until 1953, when Harrington found a death certificate from Sacramento, California, dated 1852. It named an Ezekiel Porter who had supposedly escaped the Devil's Own Hollow in Missouri. It's not possible to say for sure that this was the same Porter who sold land to the Blackwoods, but the timing and the mention of a hollow in Missouri make it seem likely. We don't know exactly what happened to Porter while he was in the Basin, but his quick departure and apparent flight to the other side of the continent suggest that something very bad happened. When the Blackwood family first moved to the Ozarks, their neighbors and travelers who passed by didn't have any immediate reasons to worry about them. Several people said that Josiah Blackwood was a strict but normal frontier patriarch. He had a beard, didn't talk much, and was able to take care of himself. A letter from Reverend Thaddeus Wilson, a traveling minister, dated September 1852 and kept in the archives of the Springfield Ministerial Association, talks about meeting Josiah on the way to Hollister. I met a tall man with a serious look who said he was Blackwood. When I asked about the health of his family and offered to pray with them at their home, he firmly but politely declined, saying that they practiced their own faith in their own way. This insistence on religious independence was not uncommon in mid-19th century America, where denominational lines often blurred and family-centered worship was common. However, what would later turn out to be important was how the Blackwoods slowly stopped even these limited social interactions. Local merchant records show that by 1855, Josiah's trips to town had gone from once a month to once every 3 months. And by 1860, he only came around twice a year, and he was always alone or with adult men who were thought to be his sons. The Blackwood homestead had grown a lot since its humble beginnings. By 1884, according to tax records, there was a main house, 3 smaller cabins that are arranged in a rough semicircle around the main house, a barn, a smokehouse, and a number of other buildings on the property. A hand-drawn map that came with the 1,880 tax assessment shows how these buildings were arranged. It also shows fields that were farmed, an apple tree orchard, and a spring that provided water for the property. When rain washed away the only road in October 1884, it set off a chain of events that would eventually reveal what many researchers later called a society unto itself, with its own rules that were hard to understand. The Blackwood property was in a natural depression, with steep ridges on 3 sides and elevations rising more than 800 feet from the valley floor. Geologists call this a box canyon. The only way in was through a narrow path to the east that followed the course of Stillwater Creek, which is a small stream that flows into the James River. But the most disturbing thing about this case isn't the fact that the Blackwood land is so far away from everything else. It's what decades of that isolation had done to it. The geography made a natural fortress that kept people from being seen by outsiders. Dr. James Harrington wrote about the case in his unpublished 1953 study, Isolated Communities of the American Interior. He called the location pathologically perfect for the development of a closed society. After he went missing in 1957, his field notes were found among his belongings and included hand-drawn maps of the property that show how isolated it really was. Harrington wrote, "The basin's acoustic properties are especially interesting. Sounds don't travel past the ridgeline, and sounds from outside the valley don't easily get in. The effect is that all of your senses are cut off from the outside world." Local folklore, collected by Vance Randolph in his 1933 work Ozark Mountain Tales, includes stories from before the Blackwoods arrived, about the basin being a place where sounds don't belong. However, Randolph said that these stories were due to the superstitious nature of early settlers rather than any acoustic anomaly. What we know about daily life at the Blackwood homestead comes mostly from 3 sources. Margaret Blackwood's journal, which was found in 1943 while the Greene County Courthouse was being renovated and was apparently misfiled with property records. Testimony given by local postmaster Elias Whitmore to the Missouri State Police in November 1884. And most disturbingly, the medical examiner's reports compiled after what would later be called the intervention. These documents, along with some letters and county records, help us put together the events that led to what one official report called conditions inconsistent with recognized human society. Margaret Blackwood's journal starts out as a pretty normal story about life on the frontier, with entries about the difficulties of building a home in the remote Ozark wilderness. However, several sources confirm that the Blackwood property was physically and sensorially cut off from the surrounding communities in a way that made it easy for people to develop practices that were different from what was normal in fodder. Society. The first entries, from 1851 to 1853, talk about clearing land, planting crops, and meeting travelers who passed through the area. "Josiah thinks we've found our Eden," she wrote in April 1852. "Here, away from the corrupting influence of towns and false churches, we may raise our children according to the true word." These early entries suggest that the family's initial motivation for seeking isolation was religious separatism, though the text doesn't make it clear what they believed. What is clear, though, is that the Blackwoods brought with them a certain way of understanding biblical teachings that would later be used to explain their increasingly obvious actions. In August 1852, an entry talks about Josiah reading the old books and says that he finds in them the truth about the patriarchs and their ways which the modern churches have abandoned. This mysterious reference to old books shows up a lot in the early journal entries, which suggests that Josiah had texts other than the Bible, like apocryphal works or obscure religious commentaries that helped shape his worldview. Around 1857, there is a big change in the journal. References to contact with people outside the family become less common. The entries are more about what is going on inside the family and how Margaret is becoming more worried about how strict her husband is becoming with their daily lives. "Josiah doesn't let the kids talk to travelers anymore," she wrote in June 1857. "He says the outside world carries corruption in its very breath." By 1860, The journal entries say nothing about the family having any contact with people from outside, which suggests that they were almost completely cut off from the outside world. The journal also shows how the family's religious practices changed over time. In the beginning, Margaret writes about traditional prayers and Bible readings. By 1858, she writes about Josiah's new rituals and ceremonies at the full moon. Josiah has taken to leading the family in what he calls the old worship. Reads an entry from September 1858. He reads from his private book and marks their foreheads with ash, while the kids stand in a circle. I don't think this is the Christianity we brought with us from Tennessee. This idea of creating family-specific rituals fits with later observations about the Blackwood's strange religious beliefs. The journal entries that start to show up around 1861, when Rebecca, the oldest Blackwood daughter, would have been about 16 years old, are probably the most troubling. Margaret writes, "Josiah has announced that Rebecca is to be joined soon. When I asked who, he looked at me like I was crazy and said, 'To the family, of course,' as it was in the beginning."
I don't understand what he meant, but his eyes scared me into silence.
Later entries get more and more mysterious about this, mentioning Rebecca's preparation and the joining ceremony, but never clearly saying what these terms meant. In 1863, the journal has the first clear sign that Margaret knew something was very wrong with her family. She wrote, "I can no longer see what Josiah calls purity. The children born now carry the mark of our sin in their very flesh, yet he sees this as proof of divine favor, saying that we are returning to the original state before the world was corrupted." This entry suggests that by this point, the consequences of what appears to have been multi-generational inbreeding were becoming physically apparent in newborn children. The family that had come 3 decades earlier had grown a lot by 1884. Records from a church in nearby Hollister show that Margaret Blackwood had 7 more children after they moved to the Ozarks. The last birth recorded took place in 1863. These records only exist because Josiah Blackwood brought each newborn child to be baptized. He stopped doing this after 1863, but the reasons are not known. These records do not indicate the fate of these children upon reaching adulthood, nor do they explain the absence of marriages involving Blackwood descendants in county registries throughout Missouri or Arkansas. The lack of these records would later turn out to be the first thread that, when pulled, began to unravel the dark tapestry of the Blackwood legacy. The baptismal records themselves show that something strange was going on in the family. In addition to the later baptisms, there are notes from the officiating ministers, like "child appears unwell" or "infant shows unusual features." In one case, from 1862, the minister wrote, "Requested medical attention for the child," which the father refused. "May God have mercy on this family." These notes suggest that even people who weren't part of the family were starting to notice signs of genetic problems as Josiah's Boras. Interactions with the community became less and less common. Elias Whitmore, who was the postmaster in Hollister from 1855 until his death in 1892, gave the best outside view of the Blackwood family. His testimony to investigators in November 1884 says that the Blackwoods would only come to town 3 or 4 times a year. They always came with wagons full of ginseng root, animal pelts, and sometimes strange carved items that tourists visiting the region's new health spas were eager to buy. Whitmore said, "They stayed to themselves. Josiah did all the talking. I knew the women for many years, but they never spoke. Even in the hottest part of summer, they hid their faces under bonnets." Whitmore's testimony also says that Josiah would collect mail during these visits, but never sent any letters, which suggests that the family didn't communicate with the outside world. Whitmore remembered that he'd asked for any mail for Blackwood, but there never was any. Not once in almost 30 years. When asked to explain who the women with Josiah were, Whitmore's testimony becomes very vague, which makes it seem like he doesn't want to talk about what he may have seen. "There were similarities," he said. There were more similarities than there should have been, if you know what I mean. Thomas Gardner, the owner of the Hollister General Store where the Blackwoods did business from time to time, gave more evidence that supports Whitmore's story. Gardner said, The old man Josiah got older like everyone else, but the women with him were all the same in a way that wasn't normal. Year after year, they looked too much alike, if you understand me. When investigators pushed Gardner to explain this, he reportedly said, "I'm a God-fearing man. I don't like to speak ill without certainty." But there weren't enough different faces among them for how many there were. The Taney County Historical Society has Gardner's sales records, which show that the Blackwoods bought a lot of basic supplies like flour, salt, ammunition, and tools, as well as a lot of medical supplies like laudanum, camphor, and patent medicines. A note from 1876 says that Josiah bought 6 bottles of Dr. Wilton's quieting syrup, which is known to have a lot of morphine in it for his nervous conditions. These purchases suggest that family members may have been trying to deal with pain or other symptoms, possibly related to the physical conditions that medical examiners later found. The unusually heavy autumn rainstorm that hit Blackwood in October 1884 was the last straw that finally brought the situation to light. Meteorological records from that time say it was the biggest rainstorm the area had seen since records began in 1837, with some areas getting more than 15 inches of rain. The heavy rain made Stillwater Creek overflow its banks, washing away the narrow path that connected the Blackwood property to the outside world. It also caused landslides that cut off the basin even more. When Josiah didn't show up to pick up mail and supplies as planned in early November, local merchant Thomas Gardner told Sheriff Robert Ledbetter that the old man hasn't come down from the hollow. Later court documents say that the sheriff didn't think anything was wrong at first, saying that those mountain folk often go months without showing their faces. It wasn't until December 3, 1884, when a hunting party led by James Holloway found signs of trouble at the Blackwood property, that the police finally had to look into it. Holloway's written statement, which is still in the county records, tells how his group, which had taken a wrong turn while tracking deer, found a young woman who was dirty and in a lot of pain, wearing only a torn nightdress despite the cold weather in December. The woman, who either couldn't or wouldn't talk, took them to the edge of the Blackwood property before running back into the woods. Holloway's group saw what he called peculiar and troubling figures moving around from a distance. Holloway's statement includes a detailed description of the woman that suggests physical abnormalities that are common in people with genetic disorders. Her jaw had a strange underhung quality, and her eyes were set too far apart. Her fingers were different lengths, and her hands were misshapen. Her gait was the most disturbing. She walked in a shuffling way, with her knees turned inward, as if her bones had grown wrong. This clinical description, which was unusual for a layperson in 1884, is explained by the fact that Holloway had briefly studied medicine at Washington University in St. Louis before going back to the Ozarks to run his family's timber business. Holloway's report also includes an observation that would later be important for understanding why the Blackwood family was so alone. The woman looked scared not just of us, but also of the forest. She kept staring at the trees as if they were going to come to life. Someone who had never been outside a small space acted like this. For them, the open world was as strange and scary as a different planet might be to us. This suggests that at least some members of the Blackwood family may have been kept in such complete isolation that they had never left the basin. When they got back to town, Holloway's report led Sheriff Ledbetter to put together what records call a party of concerned citizens to look into the Blackwood property. On December 4th, this group, which included the sheriff, 2 deputies, Dr. Elias Porter, the county doctor, and 4 armed men from well-known local families, left for Blackwood Hollow. The trail was still partially washed out from the storms in October, which made their trip harder. The sheriff's official report says that they had to leave their horses about 2 miles from the property and walk through terrain that got harder and harder. Official reports with clinical detachment recorded what they found when they got to the homestead on the 5th of December, 1884, but the personal journal of Deputy Sheriff William Hayes, which was found among his things after he died in 1912, gives a more vivid picture of what the party went through. Hayes wrote, "The main house was in the middle of what I can only call a compound. People in the windows of cabins on the outskirts watched the approach. As we got closer, these sentinels didn't make a sound, but we could feel their eyes on us. We could smell it before we got off. The smell of dirty bodies, spoiled food, and something else I can't quite put my finger on. Something's wrong. Hayes's story goes on to say that the people who were looking into the matter were met with neither resistance nor welcome at first. This made for an uneasy atmosphere of watchful silence as they got closer to the main house. Hayes went on, "As we got closer, Josiah Blackwood came out of the main house. He looked a lot older than he was, with a long white beard that almost reached his waist and skin that felt like tanned leather. He didn't seem surprised or worried when we got there. Instead, he looked at us with the same detached curiosity that one might show an unusual bug." When Sheriff Ledbetter told the old man why we were there to look into reports of a woman in trouble, he smiled in a way that made my blood run cold. "My family is not in trouble," he said. Hayes's journal describes the inside of the main house in great detail, including how the sleeping areas were set up in a way that was different from what was normal. There were no real bedrooms on the upper floor. Instead, there were small cells, each with a wooden bar on the outside to keep people inside. There were rough pallets inside these cells, and many of them had ropes and leather straps attached to the wall to keep people from escaping. The most disturbing room was the central one, which was bigger than the others. There, we found the old woman Margaret Blackwood, surrounded by what looked like a twisted attempt at feminine luxury. Faded ribbons hanging from the ceiling, crude drawings of flowers on the walls, and creepy dolls made of corn husks arranged in a semicircle around her bed. The official report says that when officers entered the main house, they found 27 people of different ages living in conditions of extreme squalor and moral decay. Hayes's more honest account shows what this sterile language hides. The people who lived there had physical traits that made it look like they were related to each other, even though they should have been in different family lines. A lot of them had misshapen skulls and limbs. Some were unable to articulate speech but emitted animalistic sounds upon being approached. The most disturbing thing was the clear signs of family relationships that broke every natural law and human taboo. Hayes goes on to talk about how hard it was for the investigators to figure out the exact relationships between the different people living there. When asked, those who could speak only said they were Blackwood, not giving their first names or any other details about their relationships. They called Josiah father, no matter how old he looked. This could mean that he was a religious figure, or that their family tree was so complicated that normal terms of relation no longer made sense. The investigation of the property outside of the main house turned up more disturbing things. Hayes wrote that the smaller cabins seemed to have specific purposes in the family's isolated society. One had only women and girls, from about 5 to 40 years old. Everyone was doing the same kinds of crafts over and over again, like weaving, sewing, and making the strange dolls we saw in the main house. Another building looked like a very basic school, with biblical texts written on slate boards and crude drawings of human anatomy that made it seem like they were interested in reproduction. There were 7 babies and young children in the third cabin, which I can only describe as a nursery. 2 women who looked so much alike that they could have been twins were taking care of them, but one of them looked much older than the other. Dr. Elias Porter, the county doctor who was called to look at the Blackwood family, would not put all of his findings in the official record. His report has a lot of redactions and hints at situations he didn't want to talk about because he didn't want to upset the public. However, his private medical journal, which was found after his suicide in 1887, has detailed clinical notes about physical traits that are common in people who are related by blood. He wrote, "I have seen physical and mental decline in these people that can only happen when close blood relatives breed with each other for a long time. Some individuals exhibit such extreme abnormalities that I question whether they can be accurately classified according to established medical taxonomy." Porter's journal contains precise measurements and clinical descriptions of various physical anomalies observed among the Blackwood family members, including unusual cranial formations, asymmetrical facial features, polydactyly extra fingers and toes, and various skeletal malformations. His notes about the ages and likely relationships of the people he looked at are the most troubling. Subject 14. A female aged approximately 16 to 18 years exhibits physical traits indicating she is both the daughter and granddaughter of Subject 1, Josiah Blackwood. Subject 7. A male around 30 years old seems to be both the son and half-brother of Subject 14 and the son and grandson of Subject 1. These clinical observations suggest a complicated web of inbreeding that has lasted for many generations. Porter's notes also talk about the family's health problems, such as a high rate of seizure disorders, different developmental delays, and a weak immune system. Many subjects exhibit indications of untreated chronic infections, he stated, notably affecting the respiratory system and skin. The overall health of the population suggests a gradual decline in viability that would, if continued, eventually result in complete non-viability of offspring. This clinical assessment supports the theory that by 1884, the Blackwood family's isolation and inbreeding practices had reached a point where they threatened the continued existence of the family itself. In Porter's private journal, he writes about what he calls the book, which he saw in Josiah Blackwood's possession. The subject keeps bringing up a leather-bound book that I can't figure out what language it is in. When asked about this text, he gets excited and says it has the original truth from before the corruption. He doesn't let anyone else touch this book and keeps it with him all the time. This strange text was never found or officially recorded, as it seems to have vanished during the family's chaotic move from the property. There are still many unanswered questions about the Blackwood case, including what it is and where it came from. At that point, the head of the family, Josiah Blackwood, was about 70 years old. When asked by the police, he apparently didn't realize that the way he was living was against the rules of society. Sheriff Ledbetter said that when Josiah was told he was being arrested, he was really confused and asked, "For what crime?" "This is my family. This is our way." More questions showed that the family had developed a disturbing view of the world over the decades they had been alone. In his journal, Hayes wrote, "The old man talked about cleaning up the bloodline and going back to the ways of the patriarchs. He gave examples from the Bible of marriages between family members and said that his family had been chosen to protect what his might have said it. Others had ruined. What bothered me the most was how proud he seemed of what he had made, as if the visible decline of his line was proof of its growing perfection, not its destruction." Hayes's journal has a long account of Josiah's explanation of his family structure, which the old man gave without seeming to realize how horrible it was. He talked about what he called the circles of joining, which connected each generation to the ones before it to strengthen what he called the sacred essence. When asked directly if he knew that these practices caused the visible problems in his younger family members, he said these were not defects, but the emergence of the original form before the world's corruption. It seemed like he really couldn't see how much pain his practices had caused his own descendants. Margaret Blackwood, who was in her 60s at the time, was found in an upstairs room of the main house, in bed, and not seeming to know what was going on around her. Dr. Porter's exam showed that she had advanced senility that was not in line with her chronological age. This could mean that she had mental deterioration too early, or that she had been through trauma for a long time. Later found, her journal has entries that stop suddenly in 1869, which suggests that she had lost her mind long before the authorities got involved. The last entry that can be read says, "The kids have kids now." Josiah says, "This is how we stay pure. God help me, I don't know what purity means anymore." Earlier entries in Margaret's journal show that she is becoming more aware of and resistant to her husband's increasingly disturbing behavior. "I tried to send Rebecca away when the peddler came," says an entry from 1865. Josiah learned. "He brought her to the cave. When they come back, she will be different, just like the others." This mysterious mention of the cave comes up several times in the journal, always in connection with punishments or people who tried to leave the family compound. The official survey of the property did not show any caves, so later researchers thought that it might have been in one of the nearby ridges, where it could have been used as a place to keep people and as a place for Josiah's ritual practices. In 1867, a very disturbing entry suggests that Margaret had become involved in the family's practices, either through force or psychological manipulation. I helped Sarah get ready today. I told her it was a blessing, like Josiah says. I showed her how to make the marks and say the words. I hope God forgives me for this lie. This entry suggests that by this point, Margaret had been forced to help prepare younger female family members for what seemed to have been ritualized inbreeding practices. The authorities' first priority was to figure out how the different people who lived on the Blackwood property were related to each other. This was almost impossible because many of the younger generations couldn't talk clearly, and those who could talk gave different accounts of their ancestry. Porter tried to make a family tree based on how people looked and the little information he had, but he gave up after filling 3 pages with lines that, in his words, more resembled a spider's web than any proper family tree. The county court records show that on the 12th of December, 1884, Judge Thomas Wilson ordered the Blackwood dependents to be sent to the right institutions where they could get care consistent with Christian charity. This clinical language hides what Hayes called a scene of deep misery. In his journal, the separation of family members who had only known each other in a dysfunctional way led to wailing that could be heard throughout the courthouse and beyond. Sounds less human than animal, yet conveying human grief in their terrible intensity. There was one very bad thing that happened during this process that is in Hayes's journal, but not in official records. One of the younger women, who was said to be Rebecca's daughter and Josiah's oldest daughter, broke free from the officers who were taking her to the transport wagon. But it was clear that the 3 Blackwood children who came to America in 1851 had started a complicated family tree that folded back on itself in ways that normal records couldn't explain. She ran back to the courthouse where Josiah was being held, not toward freedom, and cried out in a language that no one could understand. She bit her own tongue so hard that blood came out of her mouth when she was held back. But she kept making sounds that sounded like they were calling to the patriarch. Josiah, hearing these cries from his cell, responded in the same unknown language. His voice had an authority that instantly calmed the young woman, who then went peacefully with her escorts. The incident left all witnesses deeply disturbed by the idea that the old man had some kind of power over his descendants that went beyond normal family ties. Josiah was sent to the Missouri State Asylum in St. Louis, where records show he died 3 months later without ever admitting to any wrongdoing. The asylum doctor's notes say that he kept saying until he died that the world will one day understand the purity I have achieved. The records of the other family members are incomplete and scattered across different institutions, but it seems that many of them died within a few years of being taken out of the isolated environment where they had lived their whole lives. The youngest kids were put in orphanages with new names, which seemed like an attempt to help them fit in with normal society. However, follow-up reports show that many of them had trouble with both physical and social adaptation. There are a few interesting things in the asylum records about Josiah's short stay in the institution. Dr. Ambrose Wilcox, the doctor who was there, said that even though Josiah was very old and lived in very basic conditions, he knew a lot about some things, especially old religious practices and the theory of genealogy. Wilcox recorded several conversations in which Josiah talked about what he called the science of blood purity. He used obscure religious texts and historical examples with such fluency that it seemed like he had gone to school at some point in his early life, which is not something that is known about the family's history. When presented with evidence of physical and mental decline in his descendants, he perceives these as transitional forms, essential for attaining what he refers to as ultimate perfection. He seems to be genuinely unable to see when other people are in pain, especially when they are family. This clinical observation suggests that Josiah may have had a very serious form of delusional disorder, which may have gotten worse over the years because he was alone and had power over his descendants. What bothered me the most was that Josiah didn't seem to feel sorry for what he did, or even realize that it had hurt someone. Wilcox wrote, "The subject says that his family is a better line of human development. On the 17th of March, 1885, Josiah died of pneumonia, which was made worse by general debility. This was a common cause of death for older people living in 19th century asylums. His file says that he refused all medication during his last illness and told staff that the pure do not need the mixtures of the corrupted. His body was buried in the asylum cemetery without any family members present. A last note in his file says that he spent his last hours writing non-stop in a language that no one else could understand on any surface he could find, including his own skin when he couldn't get to paper. If these writings are still around, researchers have never been able to look at them. What makes this case stand out in American history is not just the disturbing situation of the Blackwood family, but also the apparent conspiracy of silence that followed. Within a few months of the intervention, official papers about the case started to go missing from county records. Newspaper stories that had first reported on the discovery with morbid interest stopped all of a sudden. It was like the Blackwood family had never been there by 1886. Sheriff Ledbetter and Judge Wilson wrote letters to each other about this systematic erasure. Ledbetter's grandson kept these letters and gave them to researchers in 1961. Ledbetter wrote in February 1885, "I agree that the public knowing the whole story will not help. The reputation of our county and state would be harmed too much by being linked to such a strange thing. Furthermore, those innocents who may still be salvaged from their lineage merit safeguarding from the stigma of their origins." This correspondence implies that the concealment of details regarding the Blackwood case was driven by a blend of civic pride and paternalistic concern for the youngest survivors, although subsequent historians have scrutinized whether these articulated motivations fully encapsulate the narrative. In the 1,960 seconds, historian Eleanor Pewitt found letters between Judge Wilson and several well-known Missouri families. This led to a more sinister interpretation of the record suppression, suggesting that the Blackwoods' isolation may not have been as complete as official accounts said. In a letter from Wilson to State Senator Thaddeus Crawford dated April 1885, there is a strange line that says, "The matter we talked about concerning certain mountain people has been settled with complete discretion. Everyone who knows has promised to keep it a secret, and the records are being handled correctly. You may assure our mutual associates that no connection will ever be established. Some researchers have interpreted this vague reference as proof that the Blackwood family may have had secret ties to more respectable families in the area, ties that powerful people wanted to keep hidden." Local authorities consistently tried to stop Dr. Harrington's investigation into the case in 1953. His research notes show that he was repeatedly denied access to records that should have been available to the public. He wrote, "It seems like there is a concerted effort to erase this event from history. Elderly residents who would have been alive at the time refused to discuss the matter, changing the subject or claiming no knowledge despite evidence to the contrary." Harrington's notes describe how one elderly woman in Hollister initially began to share childhood memories of the Hollow people, before being silenced by her son, who entered the room and abruptly terminated the interview. Harrington's research did lead to one big breakthrough. He found Jacob Weaver, a former orderly at the Missouri State Asylum who had worked with Josiah Blackwood while he was in the hospital. Weaver, who was in his 90 seconds at the time, gave a full account of Josiah's last months. Weaver remembered, "The old man wasn't like the other patients. Even though he was locked up in that ward, he had power. He could get the other inmates to do anything he wanted. And even some of the staff seemed to listen to him. Dr. Wilcox talked to him for hours and took notes, like a student would with a professor. After the old man died, the doctor seemed different. He was more withdrawn and obsessed with genealogy and ancient religions. 6 months later, he quit his job and vanished. Some said he went west to start a community of his own." This interesting idea that Josiah's influence went beyond his family and might have even affected trained medical professionals adds another disturbing layer to the case. If Wilcox was really affected by some kind of psychological force, it makes you wonder what kind of authority Josiah had, and if it was based on more than just being a patriarch. There is no record of what Wilcox did next, so this part of the story is still open. Harrington's determination led him to find a cemetery on what used to be the Blackwood property. The markers were simple and only had initials and dates on them. His field notes show that many of these dates were close together in certain years: 1862, 1870, and 1877. This suggests that there were events that happened on a regular basis that caused many deaths. He sent soil samples from the site to colleagues at Washington University in St. Louis, but the results of any analysis were never made public. Harrington's letters from this time show that he was becoming more and more paranoid about being watched and followed while he was doing research trips to the Ozarks. In a letter to his department chair at the University of Chicago in March 1957, Harrington wrote, "I am now convinced that the Blackwood case represents something more significant than an isolated instance of degeneracy. The systematic nature of the record suppression, the fact that locals are still unwilling to talk about it 7 decades later, and some physical evidence I have found all point to a phenomenon that has deeper historical roots and may be more widespread than was first thought. There are signs that local officials knew about the Blackwood situation long before they got involved in 1884. There may have been, and still may be, similar enclaves in remote areas throughout the Ozark region." Harrington's notes from this time mention other isolated communities he had started to look into, such as one in the Buffalo River area of Arkansas and another in the far eastern part of Oklahoma. He pointed out that there were similarities in the patterns of isolation, strange religious practices, and the fact that people in the area didn't want to talk about these communities. He wrote, "There seems to be a common origin for these cases, suggesting either a common ideological source or even a direct link between communities that seem to be separate." This theory of a larger network of isolated inbred communities was still just a guess because Harrington's research was cut short before he could fully develop it. In April 1957, Harrington went to Springfield, Missouri, to meet with an unnamed person who said they could get to sealed records about the Blackwood case. He never came back from this trip. His car was found abandoned at a rest area on Highway 60, about 30 miles from the old Blackwood property. After 6 weeks, the official investigation into his disappearance was closed without any answers. The night he went missing, a fire at his university office destroyed his research materials, which may have had the most complete account of the Blackwood case. However, conspiracy theorists have long claimed that the timing of this fire suggests that someone tried to hide his findings. In 1963, a hiker in the Mark Twain National Forest found a torn notebook stuck in a crack in a rock formation near the old Blackwood property. This was an interesting footnote to Harrington's disappearance. The notebook, which was given to the police and then to the State Historical Society, had entries in Harrington's handwriting from April 15 and 17, 1957, just a few days after he was said to have gone missing. The broken-up notes talk about his meeting with an unnamed source, who apparently showed him documents that suggested that the highest levels of state government were involved in hiding parts of the Blackwood case. The last entry, which is hard to read because of water damage, says, "Found the cave. There aren't many matches left. There are strange marks on the walls that look like JB's book. I hear that someone else has been here recently." The entry ends suddenly, leaving Harrington's fate unresolved. Historian Eleanor Pewitt did the most recent documented research on the Blackwood case in 1965. She tried to find family members who had been sent to different institutions. Her research, which was published in a little-known academic journal just before it stopped publishing, suggests that some of the younger Blackwood women had children while they were in a mental institution, and that these children were adopted out without any record of their biological parents. Pewitt wrote, "The disturbing possibility exists that descendants of the Blackwood lineage have been unknowingly integrated into the broader population, carrying forward genetic material shaped by generations of isolation and inbreeding." Pewitt's research faced similar problems to Harrington's. With many records mysteriously unavailable or having been destroyed during routine purges of archival material, the last sentence of her article asks a question that has not been answered. Is the apparent effort to erase the Blackwood case from historical memory motivated by humanitarian concern for descendants who bear no responsibility for their origins, or by a deeper societal unwillingness to confront evidence that such extreme deviations from human norms could develop within our relatively recent national past? One important finding in Pewitt's research was the discovery of an anonymous trust fund set up in 1886 to pay for the care of certain patients at different state institutions. The beneficiaries of this trust were identified only by numbers, not names, but Puig's cross-referencing of admission dates strongly suggests they were Blackwood family members. We don't know where this money came from, but its existence suggests that someone with a lot of money wanted to make sure the family got the care they needed and maybe even stay out of the public eye. It is said that the trust kept giving out money until 1932, when the last of the original beneficiaries is thought to have died. Puig's investigation came to an end when she took a job at an Australian university in late 1965, leaving her research into the Blackwood case behind. In the weeks leading up to her departure, her co-workers said she had become more and more anxious. They said she had gotten anonymous threats, telling her to stop her investigations. Even though no proof of these threats was ever found, the fact that researchers kept leaving the Blackwood case for no clear reason adds to the feeling that the incident was purposely covered up. One interesting thing about the Blackwood case that Harrington and Puig didn't fully look into was the possible link to local folklore that existed before the family moved to the area. Vance Randolph's collection of Ozark folk beliefs talks about hollow folk, or hidden people, who were supposed to live in remote valleys and follow old ways that most people had stopped doing. Randolph called these typical mountain superstitions, but the similarities to the Blackwood case are hard to ignore. If these kinds of stories were going around before 1851, it could mean that the Blackwoods weren't the first people to start an isolated community in the area. Instead, they might have been continuing or reviving practices that had been around for a long time. Some archaeological evidence found during a survey of the Mark Twain National Forest in 1962 supports this theory. Robert Chambers, an archaeologist, found the remains of what looked like older settlements in several remote valleys. These included buildings that were there before Europeans settled in the area. His report says that some of these places showed signs of people living there well into the 19th century. This suggests that some of the first settlers may have lived with or taken on the ways of life of the people who lived there before them instead of pushing them out. Chambers' report contains the enigmatic statement that certain sites exhibited cultural practices that diverged from established settler communities, yet he fails to specify what these practices entailed. Chambers' documentation of strange markings carved into rock faces near some of these settlements is especially interesting. These markings don't look like any Native American petroglyphs or typical frontier-era graffiti. Chambers wrote, "These symbols seem to make up a coherent system of notation, which could be linked to astronomical observations or some kind of ritual calendar." The pictures in his report show geometric patterns and stylized human figures arranged in circles, which are similar to the circles of joining that Josiah Blackwood reportedly told investigators about. It is uncertain if there is a direct correlation between these archaeological discoveries and the Blackwood case. However, the similarities indicate that the secluded basin where the family established residence may possess a more extensive history of atypical occupation than previously acknowledged. The Ozark wilderness has taken back the Blackwood property. Aerial surveys from 1960 showed that there were no longer any buildings and that the access road had been covered by new forest growth for a long time. The Mark Twain National Forest took over the land in 1968, which made it impossible for anyone to look into it further. Maps from the Forest Service show that no one has lived in the area before. They only show it as part of an ecological research zone that is closed to the public. This designation has led conspiracy theorists to think that the government is still hiding evidence in the Blackwood case. There isn't any solid proof for these claims, but it's true that access to the area is still limited, supposedly to protect the environment. A Forest Service worker who wanted to remain anonymous told a local newspaper in 1997 that certain areas within the forest were off-limits, even to most staff. However, he didn't explain why these areas were off-limits, only saying that they were for sensitive research projects. Today, the Blackwood case is mostly just a whispered story among people who have lived in the Ozark region for a long time. Sometimes regional folklore collections mention basin people or the hollow folk, but they never say who they are. The real records are still spread out across incomplete records in different archives. Many of these records can only be found by researchers who already know what they're looking for and where to look. new bits of information that are sometimes very interesting come to light. During renovations of the old Taney County Courthouse in 2003, workers found a sealed metal box hidden inside a wall. There was only one piece of paper in the box, a hand-drawn map of what looks like the Blackwood property, with symbols that are similar to those found in Chambers' archaeological survey. The map doesn't have a date or a signature, but there is an inscription on the back that says, "Let this place be forgotten." County officials gave the map to the Missouri State Archives, where it is said to be in restricted access storage, only available to researchers with special permission. In 1969, construction workers clearing land for a new highway near Branson found a small cave with human remains in it. This was the last disturbing part of the Blackwood story. The county coroner's report said that the remains included the skeletons of at least 7 people, all of whom had physical problems that were similar to those that Dr. Porter wrote about in his private notes about the Blackwood family. Carbon dating of the remains showed that they had been put in the cave between 1865 and 1870, which is when Margaret Blackwood's journal made vague references to family members being taken to the cave. The most disturbing thing was how the remains were arranged, in a circle around what looked like a rough altar made of stacked stones. Local newspapers only briefly reported on the find before the remains were quietly taken away and said to have been sent to the State Archaeological Department for more study. No published results ever came out, and when people asked about the discovery, they were told that the remains had been lost during a departmental reorganization. This pattern of finding evidence and then forgetting about it fits with the larger pattern of information suppression that has been a part of the Blackwood case since it was first documented. A graduate student in forensic anthropology at the University of Missouri said in 1998 that they had found some of these remains in an unlabeled storage container in the anthropology department of the university. Before she could finish her study or publish her findings, her initial analysis, which she wrote down in notes that were later given to researchers, showed genetic problems that were consistent with long-term inbreeding, such as strange skull shapes and signs of polydactyly. But the State Archaeological Department allegedly took back the remains, and they disappeared from the record again. The student's academic advisor told her not to pursue the matter any further because of political sensitivities surrounding the case. The story of the Blackwood family is a dark reminder of how easily a human community can be forgotten when its existence goes against our basic ideas about family and society. It also makes us think about what other hidden parts of our national story might be buried in forgotten archives or lost in the remote hollows of America's vast interior landscapes. These are stories that, like the Blackwoods, we have all chosen to forget instead of face. As the light fades over the old ridges of the Ozarks, it's hard not to wonder what other secrets these mountains hold. What other remote hollows might be home to communities that have been cut off from the rest of human development for generations? The misty valleys don't give away much to the average person, and the locals still don't like it when outsiders ask too many questions about the past. It seems that some stories are better not to be told. Some hollows are best left unvisited, but for those who know where to look in the broken records, the histories of institutions, and the genetic legacy that may still show up in small ways in descendants who don't know where they came from, the Blackwood case is still a disturbing example of what can happen when people get too close to each other. It serves as a strong warning about what can happen when you take isolation to its most extreme. The most unsettling thing about the Blackwood case might not be what we know, but what we don't know. Things that were lost in records, taken to graves by people who saw the intervention, or just erased from official history because the truth was too disturbing to keep. Like many of history's darkest times, we are left with pieces that give us clues about terrible things that we can only partially put together. That lack of knowledge might be a blessing in disguise instead of a loss of history. The Blackwood legacy's physical evidence has finally been taken back by the Ozarks' misty hollows. The forest has grown over the foundations of their homes. Vines have covered the rough gravestones, and time has erased the physical evidence of their lives. But the questions their case raises about human nature, about the effects of being alone, and about our ability to break away from social norms when we are not influenced by them, those questions are still there. softly echoing through the hidden valleys where the Blackwoods once carved out their disturbing, separate reality. Maybe the Blackwood legacy lives on in some genetic thread that has been passed down through generations, or in some family line whose origins have been deliberately hidden. This legacy is still there, even though it is not recognized or acknowledged in the larger American bloodline. That possibility, more than any other part of this dark time in Ozark history, may explain why so many people who know the whole story have chosen to forget rather than deal with the disturbing consequences of remembering. As night falls over the old hills, the wind blows through the trees and makes sounds that could be mistaken for people talking. Somewhere in the deepest parts of the Blackwood story, where sunlight hardly ever reaches, the echoes of the story still ring out. This is a warning from our past that some boundaries exist for reasons beyond mere social convention, and that being alone can create realities that we find hard to understand, let alone accept as part of our shared human experience.